They told me I wasn't family anymore. My mother's voice, sharp and cold, sliced through the air at the dinner table. You'll never be the legacy. Your sister is the face. You're just background. I sat there, hands trembling under the table, while my sister smiled sweetly at the attention, her perfect hair catching the chandelier light, her name already etched on company brochures and invitations. I was invisible in my own bloodline, dismissed like I didn't carry the same last name, like the years I spent buried in research and late-night strategy meetings were erased because I wasn't photogenic enough for their magazines. They paraded her in gowns, trained her smile for cameras, whispered about her being the future, while I was shoved into the shadows with staplers and spreadsheets, told to make myself useful, told to stop ruining the image. They thought I'd stay silent. They thought I'd play the ghost at their grand banquet. But when my father looked me in the eye and declared, "You will not be presenting at the shareholders' meeting, your sister will handle it," something in me snapped. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I went to my room, locked the door, and pulled out the thick binder no one knew I had been building for years. Spreadsheets, contracts, marketing projections, every move of the company mapped out, every weakness exploited, every strength amplified. It wasn't just data. It was power. And for the first time in my life, I realized I didn't need their permission to stand in the spotlight. They thought I was background? No, I was the foundation. And when presentation day came, the room full of investors would hear my voice, not hers. The night before that presentation, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, my chest tight with a fury that felt both suffocating and liberating. I replayed their words in my head like a broken record, each sentence searing into me. You're not the face. You're not the legacy. My sister's laughter echoed in my memory, her smug little smirk as she twirled her wine glass, basking in the glow of being the chosen one. I wanted to cry, but the tears never came. Instead, I felt steel running through my veins, a clarity that stripped away years of self-doubt. For too long, I let them paint me as the quiet one, the helper, the reliable girl who would keep everything running in the background while they worshipped the golden child in designer dresses. They thought I didn't notice the favoritism, the backhanded compliments, the way my hard work was repackaged as her brilliance. But I noticed everything. Every late night she spent at parties while I finished the reports for her. Every award she collected for ideas she didn't even understand. Every investor who shook her hand while reading the documents I had drafted. That night, I sat at my desk, staring at the binder I had built in secret, and I whispered to myself, "Tomorrow, you'll see me." My hands trembled not with fear but with anticipation. I organized the slides on my laptop, double-checked every statistic, rehearsed my opening line until my voice no longer shook. I didn't sleep. I didn't eat. I poured every ounce of myself into those final hours because this wasn't just a presentation, it was my war cry. They wanted a face? I would give them a mind. They wanted a legacy? I would show them the backbone that kept the empire standing. And when the morning sun bled through my curtains, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. By the end of the day, they would never again call me invisible. The morning of the presentation, my family gathered in the grand foyer of our home like royalty preparing for a coronation. My sister descended the staircase in a tailored ivory suit, her makeup flawless, her hair pinned back as though she were already the CEO. Cameras flashed as my father's business partners greeted her, shaking her hand, congratulating her for leading the legacy. I stood to the side, in a simple navy dress, clutching my binder to my chest like armor. No one noticed me. Not my mother, not my father, not the men who had sat in boardrooms where I had silently taken notes for years. They didn't even ask if I was coming along. They assumed, as always, that I would trail behind, carry the extras, fade into the wallpaper. I didn't correct them. I didn't remind them that I was the one who had been invited to speak, because they didn't know. My father had forgotten to tell me that my name was left off the program, that the investors were expecting her. What he didn't realize was that I had already spoken to the chairman, the one man in the room who still valued numbers over appearances, results over charm. He had seen my work. He knew who I was, and he had cleared the schedule for my presentation. My father thought he could silence me by omitting my name from the agenda, but I had learned long ago that power doesn't come from being introduced. It comes from standing up and taking the floor, whether they invite you or not. As the cars rolled up to the venue, my sister posed for photographs while I carried my binder into the hall. The stage was lit, the investors murmuring as they checked their watches, waiting for the show to begin. My heart pounded in my throat, but my steps were steady. I took my seat in the front row, not in the shadows. When my sister was called up to speak, she smiled like a queen stepping into her throne. But then the chairman raised his hand, his voice cutting through the applause. Actually, today we'll begin with someone else. Please welcome the architect behind the strategy you've all admired. And in that breathless silence, my name filled the room for the first time. My family turned to me, eyes wide with confusion and something dangerously close to fear, as I rose from my chair, walked past my sister's frozen smile, and climbed onto the stage. The heat of the lights hit me as I stepped onto the stage, but I didn't flinch. I set my binder on the podium, opened my laptop, and looked out at a sea of expectant faces. My voice came out calm, steady, and sharp enough to cut glass. Good morning. For years, you've been told one story about this company. Today, I'm here to tell you the truth. The room went still, every whisper swallowed by the weight of my words. I clicked the first slide, and numbers exploded across the screen. Growth, charts, market shares, projections that none of them had seen before. Gasps rippled through the crowd as I explained how I had personally restructured the supply chain, negotiated hidden partnerships, and identified untapped markets. Every statistic, every fact, every receipt had my fingerprints on it. For once, they weren't looking at my sister's polished smile. They were locked on me, eyes wide, pens scribbling to capture every sentence. My family sat frozen in the front row, my father's jaw clenched, my mother's eyes darting nervously from me to the investors, my sister's hand tightening around her glass of water until her knuckles turned white. I could feel their disbelief, their growing dread, but I didn't pause to savor it. I pressed harder. I revealed strategies they didn't even know existed, initiatives they thought had magically succeeded under my sister's leadership. I brought up receipts, literal receipts, of contracts signed in my name, memos I had authored, deals I had closed while they were too busy polishing her image. Slide after slide, the illusion they had built unraveled like cheap fabric. My sister's face was pale now, her smile gone, her carefully crafted confidence collapsing as the investors leaned forward in their chairs, nodding, some even applauding mid-presentation. By the time I reached the final slide, my voice had risen with momentum, not anger but power, the kind that no spotlight or photo shoot could manufacture. This company was never built on a face. It was built on work, my work, and if you want it to survive, then you'll need more than a pretty smile. You'll need results. The applause thundered, erupting so loud the floor seemed to vibrate beneath my heels. I didn't bow. I didn't smile. I simply closed my binder, stepped away from the podium, and looked straight at my family, daring them to speak. My father's lips parted, but no words came out. My mother lowered her gaze. And my sister, my perfect, untouchable sister, sat motionless, her empire of illusion crumbling in real time. When I walked off that stage, I wasn't the same girl who had been dismissed at the dinner table, treated like background noise in my own family. The chairman himself stood to shake my hand, his grip firm, his words deliberate. You just saved this company. Investors surrounded me, peppering me with questions, praising my foresight, asking for my input as though I had always been the one in charge. And in that moment, I realized something terrifying and liberating. I didn't need my family's approval anymore. They needed mine. My father tried to intercept me as I stepped down from the platform, his face red with a mix of rage and embarrassment. "What do you think you're doing?" he hissed under his breath, but his voice cracked, unsteady. I met his eyes without fear for the first time in my life and said, "I'm doing what you never let me do, showing the truth." He opened his mouth again, but one of the investors clapped me on the shoulder and pulled me aside before he could spew another word. My sister stood there, frozen, the ivory suit that once made her glow now looking like a costume she wasn't fit to wear. She tried to smile when reporters snapped photos, but even they had turned their lenses toward me. Her desperate attempt to hold the spotlight only highlighted her emptiness. There were no numbers, no answers, no substance behind her facade. My mother muttered something about family unity and not embarrassing each other, but her words fell flat in the roar of voices congratulating me. The chairman announced to the room that I would be taking a larger role in company strategy, and the applause rose again, sealing the shift of power before my family could stop it. I felt their eyes burning into me as I accepted handshakes, exchanged cards, and made plans for the future. For once, I wasn't walking in their shadow. They were standing in mine. And as we left the hall, my sister trailing behind me in silence, my father's furious stare boring into my back, I finally let myself smile, because the truth had been unleashed and there was no going back. That night, the silence at home was deafening. No one dared to look me in the eye as we sat at the long mahogany dining table that once made me feel so small. My father's fork clinked against his plate, but he barely ate. My mother fussed with her napkin, folding and unfolding it as though it could distract her from the humiliation of the day. My sister, she didn't speak a word. She just sat there, her shoulders hunched, staring at her untouched glass of wine, like it might somehow save her from drowning. I didn't rush to fill the silence. For years I had been silenced, dismissed, spoken over, so now I let the weight of their defeat hang in the air, until it pressed on them heavier than any words could. Finally, my father slammed his hand on the table. "You blindsided us. You embarrassed this family. Do you have any idea what you've done?" His voice was sharp, but beneath it was something I had never heard before: fear. I leaned back in my chair, meeting his rage with a calm I didn't know I was capable of. "What I've done," I said slowly, my voice cutting through the tension, like a blade, "is prove the truth. Investors don't care about who smiles in front of the camera. They care about results. And I've been delivering those results for years while you paraded a mask in front of them." My mother jumped in, her tone shrill and desperate. "She is the face, the brand, the one people recognize. Don't you understand, without her, the image—" I cut her off, my words cold and final. "Without me, there is no company." The room went still. My sister finally looked up, her eyes wide and glassy. "You stole this from me," she whispered, her voice trembling, but there was no conviction behind it. It sounded more like a plea than an accusation. I leaned forward, my hands clasped together, and locked eyes with her. "No," I said quietly. "It was never yours to begin with. You just took the credit. And now, the world knows the truth." The words struck harder than I anticipated. She flinched as though I had slapped her, and for the first time, she had nothing left to say. My father muttered something about damage control, but even he knew it was too late. The shift had already happened. The investors had seen me. The chairman had validated me, and no amount of family posturing could erase what I had built in front of them. As I rose from the table, the air crackled with the unspoken reality. The balance of power in our family had changed forever. I wasn't their silent daughter anymore. I was the one holding the legacy in my hands, and they all knew it. I didn't sleep that night. Not because of nerves this time, but because of the rush of freedom coursing through me, like I had finally stepped out from a cage I hadn't realized was locked. My phone buzzed nonstop with messages, investors asking for follow-ups, journalists requesting interviews, even old colleagues who had once ignored me now begging to collaborate. My name was finally in their mouths, not as a footnote, but as the headline. And yet, in the middle of that whirlwind, I sat by my window, staring at the city lights, thinking about how my own family had been the biggest obstacle I ever faced. The people who should have lifted me up had spent years trying to bury me. I thought of every time my father cut me off mid-sentence in meetings, every time my mother pushed me out of the photo frame so my sister could shine, every award that had been handed to her while my name was erased. They hadn't just underestimated me, they had erased me. But not anymore. The next morning, my father called an emergency family meeting in his study, his voice clipped and formal like he was addressing employees rather than blood. My sister sat there still pale, her confidence cracked beyond repair. My mother hovered near the window, refusing to meet my eyes. He began with a lecture about unity, about protecting the family image, about not letting ego tear apart what generations had built. I let him finish, then placed my binder on his desk with a soft thud. "You don't get to talk to me about ego," I said. "Not after you tried to erase me from my own work. This company only stands because I carried it when you weren't paying attention, and from now on, things are going to be different." He scoffed, but there was no weight behind it. He knew he had lost. The chairman's words, the applause, the investor's reaction, all of it had cemented what he refused to admit. I wasn't just part of the legacy. I was the legacy. And the more they resisted that truth, the more irrelevant they would become. As I stood to leave, my sister's voice broke through the silence, small and brittle. "What happens to me now?" I paused in the doorway, turned my head just enough to meet her gaze, and answered with the same calm steel that had carried me through the stage. "That depends on whether you learn how to stand on your own, or keep living off someone else's work. But either way, I'm done carrying you." Then I walked out, the weight of years of invisibility falling away with every step, replaced by something far heavier. Power, finally mine to wield. Days turned into weeks, and the ripple of my presentation spread farther than I ever imagined. Articles appeared in major business journals highlighting the unexpected strategist behind the family empire. Investors began calling me directly, bypassing my father, bypassing my sister, because they knew where the real answers lay. For the first time, I was in control of the narrative. Yet inside the family home, tension simmered like a storm trapped under glass. My father tried to reassert his dominance, storming through hallways barking orders as if nothing had changed. But the staff no longer jumped at his voice. They glanced toward me, waiting for my nod. My mother clung desperately to my sister, whispering about salvaging her public image, forcing her into photo shoots, interviews, charity galas. But every attempt backfired. Reporters only asked questions about me. My sister's eyes would glaze over as they mentioned my presentation, my statistics, my strategies, as though each word was another nail in the coffin of the image she once wore like armor. One evening, I returned from a meeting downtown to find her in the living room, surrounded by torn-up magazines and crumpled papers. She looked at me with raw, unfiltered anger. "You stole everything. Do you even realize that?" she hissed. Her voice was shaking, not with power but with desperation. I set my bag down, meeting her stare. "No, I reclaimed what was mine. You stole it for years and you thought no one would notice. But they noticed. They finally see you for what you are." She lunged forward, her face twisted with rage, but before she could spit another word, my father stepped into the room. His voice was low, tired, and for the first time in my life, almost broken. Enough. She's right. My sister froze, her eyes darting to him in disbelief, but his shoulders sagged as he admitted the truth. We pushed her aside. We thought Image would carry us, but it was her work all along. The silence that followed was heavier than any shouting match. My sister collapsed into the chair, her fury dissolving into quiet sobs. My mother looked away, shame written across her face. And I didn't gloat. I didn't laugh. I simply straightened my back and said, "Then it's time you all understand. I'm not here to play second anymore. If this family legacy survives, it will be because of me. And I won't let you erase me again." The words echoed through the house like a verdict, final and irreversible. In that moment, the hierarchy shifted permanently. I was no longer the forgotten daughter. I was the force holding everything together, and they all knew it. By the time a month had passed, the company was almost unrecognizable. Departments that once funneled everything through my sister now came straight to me. Reports, contracts, negotiations. My desk became the hub, and people actually listened when I spoke. The board invited me to strategy dinners, not as an assistant or silent observer, but as the deciding voice at the table. My father tried to fight it at first, storming into meetings with his old bravado, but he couldn't argue with results. Profits were climbing, investor confidence was stabilizing, and every successful move traced back to my plans. He could posture, all he wanted, but behind closed doors he knew the balance of power had shifted. My mother lingered on the sidelines, throwing nervous glances during dinners, whispering to my sister that it would all swing back if they held on long enough. But deep down, even she could feel it. The ground beneath them had changed. Forever. My sister grew more brittle by the day. She plastered on smiles at galas, nodded through interviews, but every question about projections or market growth made her falter. And when she tried to recite answers I had written for her, people could hear the hollowness. They weren't buying the act anymore. One evening, after another exhausting board dinner where my name dominated the conversation, I came home to find her waiting in my room. Her mascara had smudged, her voice hoarse from holding back tears. "Do you enjoy this?" she demanded. "Watching me fall apart? Taking everything from me?" I set down my coat and looked at her, steady, unflinching. "You think I wanted to take it? You had everything handed to you while I was invisible. I didn't ask for this war, but I won't apologize for finally being seen." She broke then. Really broke. She sank to the floor, her sobs echoing against the walls that once held her vanity and triumph. For a moment I almost felt pity, but then I remembered every time she stole my work, every time she smiled while I was erased, every time she basked in credit she hadn't earned. That pity hardened into something sharper. "You wanted to be the face," I told her quietly. "But without a foundation, a face is nothing. You should have known that." She didn't answer. She couldn't. And as I walked past her out of the room, I understood that this wasn't just a victory. It was the end of her illusion, and she would never recover from it. 2 months later, my life bore almost no resemblance to what it had been before that presentation. I wasn't hiding in the shadows anymore. I was sitting at the head of boardroom tables, signing contracts with my own name, traveling to conferences where people sought me out as the strategist behind our family empire. My phone buzzed constantly with requests for interviews, but I learned to choose carefully, only speaking when it served my vision, not theirs. For the first time, I was deciding what legacy meant. Meanwhile, the walls of my family's world were crumbling in slow motion. My father aged 10 years in weeks, his booming voice now a strained bark that no one respected. When he tried to undercut me in a meeting, the chairman interrupted him. "Let her finish. She knows the numbers better than anyone here." The look on my father's face told me he finally understood the truth. His authority was gone. My mother retreated into whispers and avoidance, clinging to the fragments of her old image, but she couldn't mask the way people brushed past her to shake my hand instead. And my sister, she faded like a ghost. She still dressed up, still posed for cameras, but the shine was gone. Reporters no longer asked about her, and when they did, it was only in contrast to me. At home, she barely left her room. I heard the muffled sound of her sobbing at night, though she tried to hide it. There was no confrontation left in her, no fire, just emptiness where her arrogance used to live. One evening, the three of them sat in the living room when I walked in from a late meeting. They looked up at me, not with anger this time, but with something raw. Recognition. Recognition that they had lost control. Recognition that I wasn't going to fade back into the background. My father cleared his throat, as if summoning the last fragments of his authority. "We need you," he said simply, the words strained and heavy. My mother nodded, unable to meet my eyes. My sister stayed silent, her gaze fixed on the floor. For years, I had begged for acknowledgement, for a seat at the table. Now, here they were, stripped of pride, finally admitting what I had always known. Without me, they were nothing. I stood there for a long moment, letting the silence stretch, then answered with a calm finality that made them all flinch. "You don't get to decide when I'm part of this legacy. I already am." And with that, I turned and walked upstairs, leaving them in the wreckage of their own arrogance. The shift became impossible to deny when the quarterly results were published. For the first time in years, profits soared past projections, markets stabilized, and new investors lined up, not because of a glossy campaign or a flawless photo of my sister, but because of the strategies I had laid down in detail, piece by piece. The press caught on quickly. Headlines no longer mentioned my sister's name. They spoke of me, the woman who had quietly carried an empire until the moment she stepped forward and rewrote the rules. Journalists called it the unveiling of the real legacy. My father tried to spin it as a family effort, but the investors weren't fooled. They asked for me by name in meetings. They cited my presentation in reports. They quoted my words back to me. The power my family once hoarded slipped from their hands like sand, and I didn't lift a finger to stop it. At home, the silence thickened into something suffocating. Meals were eaten quickly, conversations short and strained. My sister barely appeared at all anymore, her once perfect image reduced to hollow smiles on the rare occasions she dared leave the house. One night, I passed her room and caught sight of her through the half-open door. She was sitting on the floor in her expensive dress, makeup smeared, surrounded by stacks of clippings that all had my name on them. For the first time, she looked, small, fragile, almost human. She noticed me watching, and for a fleeting moment, her eyes pleaded with me, as if asking for some piece of the spotlight back, some chance at redemption. But I didn't move. I didn't speak. I simply closed the door and walked away, because pity couldn't erase what had been done to me for years. Downstairs, my father sat in his study with his head in his hands, and my mother paced restlessly, whispering about holding the family together. But none of it mattered anymore. The truth had been spoken, the empire had shifted, and the weight of the legacy was mine now. Not a gift, not an inheritance, a conquest. And the deeper that reality sank into their bones, the quieter they became around me, as though they knew one wrong word could shatter whatever fragile thread still held us as a family. By the time the annual shareholders' gala arrived, there was no longer any question about who represented the company. Invitations that once highlighted my sister's face now bore my name in bold print. The event hall was lined with banners showcasing the company's growth, each chart and projection tied directly to my work. As I stepped inside, all eyes turned, not to the once golden daughter in her designer gown, but to me. I wore a simple black dress, understated yet commanding, because I didn't need sequins or camera tricks to hold attention. The applause began before I reached the stage, a sound so loud and genuine it drowned out every memory of being silenced. My sister stood in the corner, smiling too brightly for the cameras, but no one was looking at her. She might as well have been wallpaper. My father walked beside me, trying to reclaim relevance by staying close, but even he couldn't ignore how people brushed past him to shake my hand first. My mother lingered a few steps behind, her face tight, as though every cheer for me was a dagger she couldn't block. When I finally took the microphone, the room hushed instantly. I spoke of the company's resilience, of the years of groundwork that had brought us to this moment, of the future I had mapped out. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't beg for approval, yet every word landed like stone, solid and unshakable. The audience erupted in applause again and again, their faith in me undeniable. And as I stood there, scanning the sea of faces lit by chandeliers, I caught sight of my sister's eyes. She wasn't angry anymore. She wasn't even crying. She just looked defeated, as if she finally understood she would never reclaim the crown she had worn so carelessly. In that instant, I realized the revenge was complete, not in shouting, not in cruelty, but in the simple, devastating truth that the world no longer saw her as the legacy. They saw me. And nothing could take that away. After the gala, the shift was permanent. My inbox overflowed with opportunities, consulting offers, speaking invitations, even partnerships outside our family company. For the first time, doors opened because of me, not because of the name I carried or the shadow I lived under. My phone buzzed non-stop, and every message, every headline, every handshake confirmed the same truth. I had become the face and the foundation, all at once. At home, the atmosphere grew unbearable for them. My father barely left his study, drowning in silence and whiskey, his pride too fractured to rebuild. My mother clung to her routines, charity events, luncheons, endless talk of family reputation. But no one listened anymore, not even the society women who used to flock to her. They only asked about me now, and each question cut her like glass. My sister. She stopped trying. She skipped interviews, canceled appearances, refused to leave her room. The girl who once bathed in flashbulbs now hid from the world, consumed by the emptiness left when her stolen spotlight was gone. Sometimes I heard her crying late at night, muffled through the walls. Other times, silence, heavier, sharper. But I didn't go to her. Not anymore. I had carried her for years, and she had let me drown. Now she was learning what it meant to stand on her own, and she couldn't. The strangest part was that I felt no guilt, only clarity. For years, they had called me invisible. They had told me I wasn't part of the legacy, that I was background, that my work was meaningless without her face to present it. But now, when investors, journalists, and strangers spoke my name, I realized something deeper. I hadn't just proven them wrong. I had rewritten what legacy meant. Legacy wasn't about image or spotlight. It was about who built, who endured, who refused to disappear even when the people closest to them tried to erase them. And as I stood in my office late one evening, the city lights glowing like embers, beneath the glass walls, I whispered to myself the words I had waited my whole life to say, I am the legacy. The months that followed were the clearest proof that everything had changed. Contracts I negotiated set records, expansion plans I designed rolled out flawlessly. And every time my name appeared in the press, it wasn't as a footnote, it was the headline. I began mentoring younger employees, women who had been silenced the way I once was, showing them that quiet work doesn't mean invisible work. They looked at me not just as a boss, but as proof that resilience could rewrite destiny. Meanwhile, my family unraveled in slow motion. My father resigned from most of his roles, though he pretended it was his choice. I knew the truth. He couldn't bear the humiliation of being sidelined in front of men who once obeyed him. My mother shrank into the background she once condemned me to, rarely leaving the house except for social events where people whispered about how the family had shifted. She pasted on smiles, but I could see the cracks. My sister became a ghost. She drifted through rooms without purpose, eyes hollow, her phone no longer lighting up with invites or praise. At first, she lashed out, accusing me of betrayal, of ruining her life. But over time, even her anger evaporated. She stopped speaking to me entirely, as though silence could undo what the world had already decided. One evening, I found her sitting, alone on the balcony, staring out at the city with a look that chilled me. Not rage, not envy, but emptiness. For a moment, I almost reached out, almost offered her the lifeline she had never given me. But then I remembered the years of erasure, the way she smiled while my work was stolen, the way she watched me fade without lifting a finger, and I realized my story wasn't about fixing her. It was about finally stepping into myself. That night, I returned to my office and signed a document that formalized my role as majority strategist, a title that carried more weight than any face ever could. As the ink dried, I knew the revenge was complete. Not because I had destroyed them, but because I had risen so high above their attempts to erase me that they could no longer touch me. The girl who once sat at the edge of the table, silent and unseen, was gone forever. In her place stood a woman who had claimed her legacy and made it undeniable. It was almost poetic how the world forgot my sister in the very same way my family had once forgotten me. Her photos stopped appearing in the magazines, her name dropped from the invitation lists, and the last brand partnership she clung to quietly cut ties when sales tanked under her influence. She became a shadow drifting through the house, draped in silk robes that now looked more like costumes than power. My mother fussed over her endlessly, whispering about comebacks and second chances. But the truth hung in the air like smoke. No one was waiting for her return. My father, once the loudest voice in any room, grew quiet too. He avoided me at dinners, as though speaking to me would remind him that the empire he tried to build on image had been salvaged by the daughter he dismissed. I would catch him staring, sometimes his jaw tight, eyes dark with the weight of unspoken regret. But he never apologized. He couldn't. Pride had caged him too tightly. I didn't need the apology anymore. I didn't need anything from them. One evening, after a long day of meetings downtown, I walked into the house to find them all sitting in the living room, waiting for me. My mother's face was pale, my father's shoulders slumped, my sister's eyes rimmed red. For a moment, I thought they might finally say the words I had waited my entire life to hear. Instead, my father cleared his throat and muttered, "We just want things to go back to the way they were." I almost laughed. Go back? Back to being invisible? Back to watching my work paraded around under someone else's name? Back to silence? I stood in the doorway, my bag still in hand, and answered with a finality that made my mother's lip tremble. The way things were is dead. You killed it the day you told me I wasn't part of the legacy. The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. My sister buried her face in her hands. My father stared at the carpet. My mother tried to speak but couldn't. And I turned, walked upstairs, and shut my door, not with anger, not with vengeance, but with the quiet power of someone who no longer needed validation. Because I had already won. Weeks blurred into months. And by then, the family house felt less like a home and more like a museum of a dynasty that had crumbled from the inside. My sister hardly came downstairs anymore. Her footsteps had vanished from the marble halls, replaced with the echo of silence that once belonged to me. She spent her days scrolling through old clippings where her face once dominated covers, desperately trying to stitch together fragments of relevance that were gone forever. My mother became a shadow too, drifting from room to room, muttering about saving appearances, but her words carried no weight. The social circles she prized had already shifted their loyalty. Those women now angled for my time, praising my vision, trying to attach themselves to my growing influence. And my father, once the roaring figure who commanded attention with every word, had shrunk into someone almost unrecognizable. He sat for hours in his study, staring at unopened letters, half-finished whiskey glasses lining his desk like markers of defeat. He rarely raised his voice anymore because what was the point? No one listened. They all knew where the power rested now. And me? I had never been busier, never been freer. My calendar filled with meetings across continents, not because of my family name, but because people sought me. Journalists called me a disruptor. Colleagues said I was the hidden architect finally unveiled. Investors stopped by my office not to flatter me but to negotiate on my terms. And for once, I realized I wasn't living in reaction to anyone else. I was writing the story, line by line. There were nights when exhaustion hit me hard, when I sat in my office surrounded by charts and plans, staring out at the glittering skyline and remembering the years I spent silenced. Sometimes I caught myself wondering how I endured it for so long. The dinners where my words were drowned out, the boardrooms where my sister claimed my work, the late nights when I whispered ideas to myself just to feel like they existed. But then I thought of the day I stood on that stage, the silence that fell before I spoke, the way the world shifted in a single breath, and I knew every invisible year had forged me for that moment. My revenge wasn't loud. It wasn't about humiliating them in public or watching them fall apart, though both happened without my effort. My revenge was standing tall in the very place they swore I didn't belong, carrying the weight of a legacy they tried to deny, me and proving, without shouting, without begging, that I was the backbone all along. I didn't scream when they told me I wasn't part of the legacy. I didn't cry when they laughed behind my back. I simply waited, built quietly, prepared, relentlessly, and when the time came, I opened the door they thought was locked forever, and once it opened, it never closed again. Now when I walk into a boardroom, people rise. When I sign documents, the future bends with my pen. When I speak, even my father leans forward in silence, as though waiting for a verdict. And in the empty halls of our family home, I hear the irony ringing louder than applause. The daughter they erased became the very thing they claimed she could never be. I was no longer chasing their approval. I was beyond it. And that was the sweetest revenge of all. The final turning point came quietly, not with shouting or applause, but with a kind of silence that felt permanent. Months after the gala, after the headlines, after the investors had shifted every ounce of trust in my direction, I walked through the front door of the house and realized it no longer belonged to me, not in the sense of walls and furniture, but in spirit. It was still filled with marble and chandeliers, still heavy with the scent of polished wood, but it was hollow. The laughter that once echoed there, shallow and cruel, had been replaced with an uneasy stillness. My sister drifted like a ghost through the halls, her eyes empty, her voice barely more than a whisper when she bothered to speak at all. My mother clung to her, still muttering about image and redemption. But even she knew it was too late. Their world had cracked wide open, and no amount of pretense could tape it back together. My father rarely left his study anymore. He avoided my gaze whenever we crossed paths, as though he couldn't bear to see his reflection in the daughter he had tried so hard to erase. Sometimes I wondered if regret haunted him late at night, if he ever replayed the moment he told me. I wasn't part of the legacy. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. It didn't matter anymore, because I had stopped needing their recognition a long time ago. The world beyond those walls had already seen me, already claimed me, already placed my name where it could never be hidden again. The board looked to me for leadership. The investors trusted my judgment. My strategies didn't just save the company, they redefined it. I was invited to conferences around the world, speaking not as someone's daughter, not as someone's sister, but as the woman who had built the backbone of an empire. I became the face and the foundation at once, not because I chased it, but because I had earned it. And in the process, I discovered something deeper than revenge: freedom. Sometimes, late at night, I sat by the window of my own office, high above the city, and thought of the girl I used to be, the one who sat silently at the edge of the dinner table, ignored, diminished, erased. I wanted to tell her it was worth it, that all the years of invisibility, of swallowing words and burying brilliance, would lead here, to this moment, where her voice would fill rooms, where her work would outlive her doubters, where she would no longer need anyone's permission to exist. My family said I wasn't part of the legacy. They said my sister was the face, that I was background, that my work meant nothing without her smile to parade in front of investors. But when the truth came out, when the lights hit the stage, when the applause thundered for me, everything shifted forever. They had built their empire on illusion. I had built mine on reality, and reality never fades. In the end, I didn't just claim the legacy, I became it. And as I turned the key to my own office one final time that evening, the city glowing beneath me, I smiled. Not because I had destroyed them, but because I had finally, irrevocably, proven that I was never invisible at all. I was the legacy they tried to bury, and now the world would never forget my name.